Hey there, what are you doing?
Just looking at birds.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris. Join me as I interview avid birders to learn more about birds, birding, and those who love both. Today my guest is Jeff Babson. You might remember him from episode 7, where he shared with us about the Montezuma quail and his passion for making birding accessible. For those of you that are not familiar with Jeff, he's an all-around naturalist who currently works for the Pima County Department of Natural Resources, Parks and Recreation, as the county's wildlife viewing program specialist. He also runs his own eco-tour and environmental education company called Sky Island Tours. Since this is Jeff's second time on the podcast, we won't be revisiting the usual set of interview questions. So for answers to those, please check out episode 7. Today we will talk a little bit about the effects of the increased rainfall here in the Southwest, a new season of birding, and wild turkeys. It's good to have you on today, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Chris. Pleasure to be here.
With the weather finally cooling down a bit, we're seeing highs below the 80s. Have you been able to take advantage of this weather and get out for some birding?
Absolutely. It's a great time to be out because the mornings and evenings are nice and cool, the day's nice and warm, and there's lots of bird activity to be seen. Just this morning, I was at Agua Caliente Park on the northeast side of Tucson and saw sure signs of migration going on. Ringneck ducks are coming back. Northern flickers are coming back to spend the winter with us. But yet there was a flock of white-winged doves. So the summer birds are still here. And of course, things like Gila woodpeckers and curve-billed thrashers are always around. And earlier this week, I had a trip and we were at the Las Ciénegas National Conservation Area near Sonoyta. And there was northern harriers flying around, and that's another indication. So we're starting to see the arrival of the wintering species, and the summer breeders are getting harder and harder to find as they've retreated mostly to the south for our winter, but we'll be back in the spring.
Speaking of the spring, winter, and the weather, something that was a little different this year was the increase in rain we saw. I know that we saw a lot more flies, beetles, moths, butterflies, and my own yard briefly resembled a miniature rainforest. Can you tell us how some of these things are connected?
Absolutely. So it was a delightfully wet summer monsoon season for us here in southern Arizona. And it was really interesting to follow on the heels of the exceptionally hot, dry year that we had last year. And so the desert was parched, the plant life was parched, the rains came, and there was just an explosion of growth. Seeds germinated and grew really fast to produce flowers that ultimately led to fruit. So there was flowers everywhere, there was abundant vegetation everywhere, and hand in hand with that, we had the insects. And this year was the best year for butterflies I have ever seen in southern Arizona. They were everywhere. Some of the small flies that might be a little bit of an annoyance as they fly in your ears and that sort of thing, they had a great year as well. And so it was a terrific year for the desert because of the rainfall, and the natural world responded as we would expect. And a good year for the plants and insects means a good year for the birds because there's more food for them. For things like Gambel's quail and curve-billed thrashers, there's more cover because there's more plants to hide in. So it was a really good year all around. I don't know any hard facts, but I would suspect that nesting success was pretty good this year for most of the desert birds.
Going back to what you said about the explosion of plant life and insect life, what are some of the reasons there is an increase in the beetle population, like ground beetles?
Okay, that's a good question. So there seems to be a general two-step process that has to occur to get these huge numbers. The first step we had last year, where we had a really dry year and not many beetles or butterflies or moths were seen because they just didn't develop. And so that's bad. But the good side of that is their predators and parasites also didn't do very well. So you have that bad year where the parasite and predator numbers drop down, and then you have a good year like this. And with the parasite and predator numbers low, there's less mortality. So for every egg that's laid, that many more are going to survive to adulthood to fly around in your garden or fly in your ear. And so you can't have the abundance we had this year without the really poor year we had last year. And so those sorts of explosions in numbers tend to be relatively short-lived. And by that, I mean by the end of this flight season, so September, October, parasites and predators were also surviving in good numbers because their own predators and parasites weren't around. So that it's a kind of a short-lived success. And then by the time, next spring rolls around, things will probably be pretty much back into a normal state of affairs. Although not knowing what the winter rainfall is going to be like yet, that will have an impact to some degree, but we just have to wait and see what that's going to be. But next year, assuming we get rain, there will be a lot of butterflies, but probably not as many as we saw this year because some of them are going to get taken out of the population before we get a chance to see them.
What are some of the predators of butterflies that would prevent them from
So
increasing
birds
numbers?
are big predators of butterflies, lizards as well, but their biggest predators are actually other arthropods. So spiders, dragonflies, beetles. There's several families of wasps and true flies that are parasites, and so they feed on the larvae. So the caterpillars never get a chance to develop. Those parasitic wasps and flies are really essential for keeping caterpillar numbers in check. And for every caterpillar that doesn't survive until pupation, then there's going to be that one less butterfly or moth to fly around later in the season. Very small parasitic flies and wasps are very important for keeping populations in check, but we don't really notice them very often because they're so small. We tend to focus on the bigger things that we can see, like the dragonflies, like the spiders, and a butterfly in a spider web, or a bird going out and grabbing a butterfly and then flying back to a perch to consume it. So just like everything else out there, there's a whole bunch of predators. Otherwise, they'd overrun the place. And so at every different level in the food chain, they have their predators.
One of the interesting things I noticed this season, for the first time I saw a ground beetle eating from a caterpillar. And I thought, why doesn't this happen more often? When I started thinking about it, this is just a slow-moving pouch of nutrients. And this ground beetle is much faster. So I thought, how do any of these caterpillars make it to a butterfly?
It's amazing. It's every butterfly you see flying around is one of the lucky ones, because they were able to survive the gauntlet of predators, parasites, disease, the vagaries of the weather. And so they're the lucky ones. It's just that this year there was a lot more lucky ones than we normally see.
Than usual.
But if you're a predator, or a parasite for that matter, caterpillars are, like you said, they don't move particularly quick, and they are basically fabulous meal. And that's why we see birds like warblers and vireos and wrens. They just do a number on caterpillars because they're picking them off of tree trunks or branches or the leaves or whatever. But a lot of things will eat them, and their best strategy, for the most part, is to not be seen at all. So you look around in your yard and you might not see many caterpillars because that's when, birds and lizards tend to be active. Dragonflies are active. Those are all diurnal predators. The numbers of those go way down during the evening. And so if you want to see caterpillars, one way you can do it is go outside in your backyard with a flashlight at night, or even a black light that you use for like scorpions, because many of the caterpillars have this very interesting pattern on them, and they're really visible at night. Whereas if you went back to that same shrub in the daytime and you just can't find them, and you go back to that shrub in the night, and it's like, oh, there's 5 of them on here. I couldn't find one of them. That's kind of their main strategy. Some of them have, toxins in them. Some of them are covered with hairs or spines that make it difficult for predators to consume them, but they're very vulnerable and everything wants to eat them. So their best strategy is to not be detected at all.
Earlier, you talked about the survivability of clutches with birds and how they probably had a good season. Can you talk a little bit more about why these clutch sizes are maybe larger and how they're able to survive better than last year? So
there's probably a couple of things going on. Number one, when you have the year we had this year, there's just an abundance of food. So the parents are getting enough food. They get enough food for their offspring, which might be caterpillars.
Yeah.
And at the same time, pretty much, if let's just switch gears and go to a raptor. Like if you're a red-tailed hawk that may feed on birds if given the opportunity. Well, the ground squirrels, the rabbits, they probably had a really good year as well. So there's sort of so much food out there that of various sorts that many things have a higher survivability. But more specifically, like for a songbird, most songbirds will feed their young insects because it's got the nutrients in them that they need to grow. So when you have an abundant insect year, you're going to have very little, the young aren't going to starve to death.
Yeah.
And even, snakes are big predators of nests, but same thing holds true for snakes as holds true for like a red tail. There's just all kinds of food out there. And most snakes are not necessarily specialized to raid just bird nests. So, for every ground squirrel that gets consumed, that's one less nestling, I guess you kind of have to worry about. So
Sure.
It's kind of an abundant, high amounts of food for the babies, the chicks, but also so much food out there that the predators have more options and they may not predate bird eggs, bird nestlings or fledglings as much as they might in other years.
Previous, yeah. In the Southwest, while we experience a drop in temperature, we don't really see any snow. Personally, this is my favorite weather of the year, and it's a wonderful time to see some new birds. Can you help us understand why we're seeing some of these new birds?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Chris. This is a wonderful time of year here in Tucson. This time of year, so you have a lot of the things like the warblers, the hummingbirds, the tanagers, things of that nature. They've all migrated. They've gone south for the winter, maybe to Mexico, maybe to South America. It depends on the species. And so some of the stars of the birding show in the spring and summer are no longer here, or they're not here in very many numbers. There might be a handful of them around. It's kind of the same play with different actors. The winter is great for things like raptors that overwinter here. We get some species that we see only during the winter time here. It's good for sparrows. I know a lot of people sort of shudder at the thought of identifying sparrows, but we have a really good variety of sparrows here during the wintertime, and they're usually in pretty good numbers, so that's another thing. Waterfowl, as things get cold up in the north and ponds and lakes freeze over, the birds have to go somewhere, and they'll come to southern Arizona for that, among other places. And also some shorebirds will overwinter here as well, things like greater yellowlegs, for example, and long-billed dowitcher, and some least sandpipers. They have access to their food, and that's why they're here. So to me, birding is good in our area 365 days a year. It's just that depending on the season, your targets might change.
Sure. So when you talk about them moving down here from different parts that may experience snow, cold weather, is that the primary reason they're leaving their current habitat? Is it because it's too cold, they want to move to a warmer place?
It's not so much the temperature, although I'm sure at some level that does play at least a minor role. It's more that they don't have access to their food anymore. So, if you're a northern pintail duck and you're breeding up in the prairie pothole region of the Great Plains, at some point, if it hasn't happened already, at some point those little ponds are going to freeze over and you no longer have access to your food. It's covered by ice. So in order to survive, you have to go somewhere where there's food. The same is true of something like a sparrow or a finch. If they don't have their food, they're going to vacate the one area to find another area where their food is. So we, as humans, we often link the temperature with migration, both in the spring and the fall, because that's when we notice it. From the bird's perspective, I don't think it has much to do with it. As the weather turns inclement further north, many birds will vacate those areas and they'll come down here or even further south, or they'll go wherever they're going to go for the wintertime.
Yeah.
In the spring, they're going up there partly because the food is more abundant, but also because there's fewer predators, there's fewer parasites in like the northern hemisphere than there are in the tropics. So what that means is you can raise more young, per nesting attempt, more
Sure.
young per season, because you might have 2 or 3 broods depending on your species.
Yeah.
And so the good thing from the food perspective in the spring is there's an explosion of food in the spring. Once the winter passes and the leaves start to green up, you get flowers, which bring in insects, which bring in other insects, which bring in the birds. And so migration, to me, is more of a food-related issue as opposed to a weather-related issue.
Okay. With all these migrants coming into Tucson, what are some of the regular migrants we might see?
That's a very good question. We could go on and on about this, but I'll just hit a few. So from the raptor perspective, birds that I really look forward to seeing at this time of year include northern harriers, ferruginous hawks. Those are both spectacular hawks to observe, and they're fairly common in agricultural areas or grasslands. Sparrows, we get a large variety of sparrows that come in for the wintertime. So things like brewer sparrow, vesper sparrow, white-crowned sparrows. You look in the flocks of white crowns, you might see a white-throated or a golden-crowned or a Harris's mixed in with them. So you have lark buntings. So we have a large variety of sparrows.
Yeah.
And then we also get a lot of waterfowl, ringneck ducks, redheads, canvasbacks, northern pintails, northern shovelers, the teal. Depending, obviously, if you're in the grasslands, you're probably not going to see any waterfowl. But,
Yeah.
Those are kind of things that I think of when I'm going to go out in the field at this time of year, that depending on exactly where I'm going, I'll be looking usually for at least 2 of those 3 groups.
One of the things as I was getting into birding, learning about birds that came during the season, the sandhill crane. That was one that was brought up frequently. What's special about that, or why do you think I heard that so frequently early on?
Probably because they're spectacular. They're big birds. Some of them are coming all the way from eastern Siberia and northwestern Alaska to spend the winter with us, and they're a little bit different. We've talked a bit about migration, and migration as a whole is a very complex phenomenon, and we're still learning things about it, many things about it. But what the cranes do is the babies follow their parents on their first migration, and they basically memorize the route that they follow. And so this is why you'll often get the same birds coming back year after year, because they've memorized the route. Whereas something like a brewer sparrow, it may not memorize the route. It might just go wherever it can to find enough food. It may very well memorize the route. We don't know that. But we do know that sandhill cranes, among other birds, memorize the route that they're going to take. So they tend to show up much more regularly in the same spots. And so the number of sandhill cranes that we get every year sort of fluctuates to some extent, but they are certainly, and I didn't mention them earlier, but they're certainly one of the stars of the show. And they're big birds. They make this sort of beautiful call that they have a lot to say. It's just the same thing over and over again. But they have this beautiful call, and when you see tens of thousands of these birds on the ground or up in the sky, and they're bugling to each other, it can take you to another place. I mean, I know it takes me a different place, and I always look forward to their return to southern Arizona.
Yeah, in my last few years of birding, I actually haven't seen any. I look forward to trying to see some this year.
Yeah, Whitewater Draw is a great spot. Whitewater Draw is sort of southeast of Tombstone.
Okay.
Sort of on the way to Douglas, and that is certainly one of the best, if not the best, winter birding site in southern Arizona, because not only do you have the thousands of cranes, you also have the chance for a variety of ducks and some shorebirds and raptors and even some owls sometimes. And so besides all the cranes, there's a lot of other birds to look at as well.
I will definitely put that on my list then. Yeah. Something else that shows up around this time of year in much of the country is snow. Many of our East Coast listeners will soon encounter it when they bird, something you likely encountered during your time spent in Massachusetts. And while I haven't personally experienced birding in the snow, can you tell us how that's different?
Yeah, it's colder. So, snow, for anybody who's tried to slog through, it's not the funnest thing in the world to slog through, especially if there's any accumulation. However, that doesn't mean that you have to stop watching birds. There are ways to do that. And so I remember when I was a kid, we had bird feeders up in the yard. And I used to really love to watch the bird feeders. We'd get like slate-colored juncos and black-capped chickadees and tufted titmice and northern cardinals and a variety of sparrows. And I always took some solace in looking at them because it never got too cold for them. They were perfectly happy, being out there regardless of what the weather. So, having a feeding station or putting a feeding station up can allow you to watch birds. It's also nice because it's a great way to really study birds because they're going to be attracted to the food. So they may stick around in a certain spot for longer as opposed to, you're walking along a trail and you spook a bird and it flies away and you never see it again. So there are advantages besides it's a little bit more tolerable to be inside. Yes. But if you want to get outside, there are still good places to bird. I think for me, one of the stars of winter birding in Massachusetts was go to the coast. Because you'll get some sea ducks, for example, or alcids like the auks and guillemots and things like that would be out on the ocean, and you can, spot them fairly easily from shore. Sometimes a scope is useful, but you don't need to have one. And they'll often get there in huge numbers, thousands and thousands of them. So you still have some opportunities. If you have a river nearby that doesn't freeze over, that's another potential source to go. Another thing about the beaches is you always have a chance in the winter for snowy owls. Probably because there's enough food for them, they'll often spend the winter along the seashore, and they look like half-melted snowmen. They have this pretty distinctive little profile to them. Yeah. So there are options for East Coasters as well as people like in the northern half of North America where it does get pretty cold and snowy during the wintertime. There are going to be birds in your neighborhood, I guarantee it. It's just you kind of have to be a little bit more focused on where you spend your time because you could go to the city park and see birds, but on the other hand, if they don't plow the trails or whatever, or not the trails, but the sidewalks, then you're getting all wet, struggling through the snow. But feeding stations are useful, and if you live near the coast, that's always productive in the wintertime.
Nice. Now let's move on to our bird segment, where my guests have a chance to share a bit about a bird of their choice. And for this episode, Jeff will tell us about the wild turkey. This time of year, many of us are thinking of turkey, although that kind is usually on a platter. Can you tell us about some of the different species of wild turkeys?
Turkeys are very much in the vernacular these days. So there are two species of turkey. There's one that lives in the Yucatan and southern Mexico and Guatemala called the ocellated turkey, which is a stunningly beautiful bird. It's got sky blue head with these orange sort of lumps on it, and the plumage is very iridescent and greenish and blue. And then you have the wild turkey, which is the one that we're familiar with in North America, and that's divided into about 5 or 6 subspecies. And those, they're basically just different geographic populations from the East Coast all the way to basically the Rocky Mountains and into the Sierra Madre of Mexico. And the ones in Arizona we have, the most common one is the Merriam's wild turkey, and that's the one that we see most often. And it has sort of a whitish or buffy tip to the tail feathers, whereas your eastern birds, if you're birding in, say, Massachusetts and you see a wild turkey, when its tail feathers are visible, it's going to have a very rusty tip to the tail. So that's one way to tell the two apart. The other one we have here in southern Arizona is the Gould's wild turkey, which is essentially a Mexican subspecies that barely makes it into the U.S., and the Arizona Game and Fish Department is working on reintroducing them into the Huachuca Mountains. They formerly occurred here, so it's not like they're being put into a place they didn't occur previously. But they were largely eliminated, and now they're being brought back. But that population has done pretty well in Mexico, and so how do you tell a Merriam's from a Gould's? Well, that's a little bit tricky. It's easy to recognize a turkey as such, but sometimes to recognize the different subspecies is a bit more of a challenge, which is what we'd expect because they are the same thing. But Merriam's wild turkey is a little bit smaller. It's got shorter legs. It's got a shorter tail. And its plumage has sort of a bronzy or purplish cast to it when the light hits it just right. If it's in the shade, it's going to look sort of dark brown or almost black. The Gould's wild turkey, again, being a little bit bigger, longer tail, longer legs, it has more of a copper and greenish reflection. So depending on the lighting conditions, those two can be really difficult to tell apart. But for the most part, if you're in the Santa Rita Mountains, for example, near Green Valley, or if you're up in the Catalinas north of Tucson, you're looking at Merriam's wild turkey. If you're down in the Huachucas, you could be looking potentially at either one of them. But that is where the Gould's is being reintroduced, and it's being reintroduced partly to restore a native population, but also to allow for hunting as well.
When you talk about these subtle differences in feather color, tell us a little bit about the difference between male and female. For example, I saw wild turkeys for the first time myself earlier this year in the spring. We were sitting at a bench, and it was very quiet down from this nearby, I wouldn't call it a mountain. Elevation might have been 50 feet higher than where we were. I see a few turkeys come down, these massive birds, and they walk closer to us. And we were sitting near some bird feeders, so they came to get some of the seeds that had fallen on the ground. And then I was within 15, 20 feet of them, so it was incredible to see them so close, this massive bird. And they just went about their business. So as we looked over time, there became 5 or 6 of them in that area. Looking at them, we were trying to identify, what's the difference between this one and this one? I wonder which one's the male. And over the course of half an hour or so, and out of nowhere, this bird that was substantially larger, probably 30% larger than size, and had a lot more going on up front.
Yeah.
It was pretty clear that was the male.
Yes.
Can you tell us about some of those visual differences?
Yeah. So just like you experienced, the males are significantly larger than the females. The coloration of the feathers is about the same. The males might be a tad bit brighter, but the coloration is basically the same on the feathers. The head coloration is different.
Yes.
The naked skin on the head is a brilliant sort of scarlet and blue on a male, where it's more like a pinkish and sort of a very light blue on the female, and there's not as much bare skin. So that's another way to tell the two apart. Also, the males typically have this tuft of feathers on their chest, which is, sometimes called the beard.
Okay.
And most females do not have that. It does occasionally show up on females, but if you look at the size, if you look at the head coloration, you should be able to determine if you're looking at a male or a female. And that tuft of feathers on the breast is really interesting to me because they look like sort of long hairs that are coming off. But unlike most feathers, or almost all feathers on birds, those feathers do not get molted. And so that's kind of this unique idiosyncrasy that wild turkeys have that most birds don't have. So that's another way. Also, sometimes turkeys can get into pretty big groups. Like there's a population in like Texas, Oklahoma, up into Kansas, the Great Plains area. It's the Rio Grande turkey. And one of the things that kind of sets them apart from the other populations is the fact that they really like each other's company. I mean, it's not unusual. Well, I shouldn't say it's not unusual. Sometimes they'll get into, 500 plus of them together. Whereas like the Merriams, or if you're back east, the eastern wild turkey, I mean, you might get, a couple dozen of them together at one time, maybe a bit more than that, but you're certainly, at least I've never seen anything close to 500. Probably the biggest group that I've seen may have had 30 or 40 birds in it, which is still pretty impressive because they're so big. But so that's another difference, that for whatever reason, that population just likes to be in bigger groups than the other ones do. And if you're looking at a group, generally speaking, especially if it's the breeding season, you're going to see more females than males. So they kind of have like a harem system where one male, they do all this fancy strutting around and they do the gobbles and they're trying to look really impressive. And usually the males will often engage in combat to sort of establish sort of a dominance hierarchy. And usually the end result of that is one male ends up hanging out during the breeding season with a group of females and no other males are included in that group, or at most there might be like an immature male that's not ready to reproduce yet.
Yeah.
But then in the wintertime, once that's all over, then some of these smaller groups can kind of coalesce into a bigger group. Quail do the same thing in the winter. So you can see bigger groups of them, but oftentimes outside of the winter aggregations, you'll see in a group you'll have more females than males.
Okay. Yeah, that's in line with my only observation of them when I saw about 7 to 8 females and a single male. When we talk about mating, what size clutches are we talking about here?
So their clutches, they're in this group they're called the Galliformes, and that's basically the chicken-like birds. So quail, pheasants, turkeys, grouse, that sort of group. And they tend to have fairly large clutches for their size. And the reason for that is they're on the menu for many predators out there. And so that includes not only from the egg stage to the chick stage. When a wild turkey, there's not really much in the way of birds that are going to feed on an adult wild turkey.
Sure.
Possibly a golden eagle, I guess, could. Their predators are more of things like bobcats, coyotes, maybe mountain lions, depending on the elevation. Snakes can get the eggs, that sort of thing. For their size, they tend to have fairly large clutches. So easily in the 10 to 12 range. Wow. And the females do all the incubation. The males, are kind of watching for danger during when the females are incubating. And then what they'll do is once the eggs hatch, they all leave the nest at once. They don't start incubating with the first egg like a lot of birds do. They'll actually wait until the clutch is complete, and then they'll start to incubate. And this is what Gambel's quail do the same thing. Yeah. And the reason for that is if they start to incubate with the first egg, then that egg might hatch.
Yes.
Around the time the last egg is being laid, which would be really bad from a survival standpoint because now the predators know where your nest is.
Yes.
So they've evolved this ability to withstand the embryos being cooler to a level that would probably be lethal for most other birds, but they're able to survive it. And that pays dividends for them down the road because they all hatch, within a very short time of each other, and then they leave the nest never to come back. So it might sound a little bit strange on the one hand to say they don't start to incubate right away, but they reap the benefit of that strategy at the end because like I said, if they were trying to incubate with the first egg, then there'd be, babies hatching potentially on the same day an egg is laid, and now you have maybe 2 or 3 weeks where a predator could find the nest, and it just doesn't work. And so they wait until the clutch is complete. They begin incubation, and then at that point, incubation proceeds in a straight line like it does in most birds, and then they all hatch at once. When I say all hatch at once, it's not like they're all suddenly pop out at the same time, but it was within a fairly short period of time, and then they leave the nest never to come back. Kind of an anti-predator strategy for them.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask. When you talked about them leaving immediately, I wondered if that was to avoid predation. When they move, are they just now roaming? Or did they find a new location to stay?
So they tend to, I would say they are somewhat nomadic. What they'll do is, again, just like birds that migrate, they're looking for sites that have enough food for them to survive and water and that sort of thing. So depending on the year and what the food production has been that year. Some years they're certainly moving further than others. But I would say for the most part, at least here in southern Arizona, the birds are pretty much in the same general area year round. And if they do have to move any great distance, they're going to get there by walking. Their sort of heavy bulk and their flight is one of those things that it's not really that conducive to long distance migration. So, they might move from one canyon to another by walking up the ridge and then down the other side. And that might be somewhere where they would spend the winter for, maybe for whatever reason, that site got a little bit more rain than the other one, and they'll have enough food. But it seems to me that for the most part, they're pretty sedentary, but there can be some local movements. And I've seen reports where they're actually moved from one mountain range to another, but they actually walk through washes to get there. They're not flying from one mountain range to another. Because I've seen wildlife camera photos out in the desert that show wild turkeys, and that's not a place where they're normally found. And it seems the most logical explanation for why they were there is they were moving from one mountain range to another.
And when you talk about them not flying very often, they do fly daily for a very specific purpose. Can you tell us
Correct.
about that?
So they spend most of their lives on the ground, walking around. They'll even sort of roost on the ground. They'll kind of just find a nice shady spot and sit down. And this is true of this big group as well, including the quail, the pheasants, the grouse, is they're all capable of flying, but they seem almost reluctant to do so.
Yeah.
And so they kind of use it as, like in a Campbell's quail, for example, they'll use it as a last-ditch way to avoid predation or getting hit by a car. This is my last chance to get out of here.
Yeah.
Turkeys do fly every day, and that's because they roost up in the trees at night. So their habitat, and this is true of all of the populations of wild turkey, their habitat is not really forest. It's more open woodland. So some trees that they use for roosting, but then a lot of open areas on the ground where there's not, short grasses or short plants that they can easily walk through, but also providing a lot of food. So here in southern Arizona, we often see them where there's oak trees because they'll feed on acorns. And if you were in other parts of their range, they may be feeding on other species of oak or maybe something like a hickory, something that produces those hard fruits that they could eat. So the plant community may change from one location to another, but the general look of the habitat is pretty consistent for them. So, some big trees around for roosting in, and then also a lot of open ground for foraging and nesting. They nest on the ground. Doesn't matter if you're in Florida or New Jersey or in Arizona. It's a pretty consistent look to their habitat. So in southern Arizona, if you've been in the Huachuca Mountains, you kind of have an idea of what their habitat looks like. And then if you travel somewhere and you're within the range of a wild turkey, then if you get in a habitat that looks similar, you could have wild turkeys there, even though you may not recognize any of the trees.
Yeah.
The character of the habitat's going to be the same. And as long as it has enough food and cover and water, then that's all they really need.
When you talk about them roosting in trees, are they roosting multiple ones in a single tree? Each one gets their own tree? How do they spread out like that?
It kind of depends. To me, it seems like they'll often roost multiple individuals in one tree. But I've also seen it where if you have two trees that are suitable, you might have some roosting in one and others roosting in the other group, but they tend to not really be solitary, meaning one per tree.
Yes.
They tend to roost multiples in the same tree.
Okay.
But with that being said, that doesn't mean that they can't, if there's a nice patch and there's 3 or 4 trees around, that there might be a few in each of the trees. I don't see them very often by themselves, ever.
Okay. Speaking of them being in the trees, I don't remember if you mentioned this, but when they nest, are they nesting on the ground or are they nesting in trees?
No, they nest on the ground. Most of that group, they're ground nesters. And so they'll tend to lay their eggs like under grasses or shrubs, things like that, to provide some concealment as well as some shade and protection from the rains and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Most of that group of birds, the chicken-like birds, do nest on the ground. There are some that nest in the trees, but those are a little bit of an exception. Most of them nest on the ground.
Okay. I remember last time when you told us about the Montezuma quail, you talked about how it was very hard to find a nest because they would hide it away. It seems like with a wild turkey, and a clutch size of 10 to 12, it would be difficult to hide that.
It is more difficult than, say, like a Montezuma's quail, just because you're talking about a bird that's 4 feet long versus a bird that's under 9 inches long. However, with that being said, they're still pretty good at blending in. And I've spent a lot of time in wild turkey habitat and seen a lot of wild turkeys. I have not seen a nest.
Oh.
That could be because I'm not looking for them.
Yeah.
But I've never seen a nest. And so one of the strategies that they have, and other birds do this too, like a killdeer will do this, which is this little shorebird type thing. They'll sit tight but oftentimes they'll actually leave the nest at some distance to the disturbance. And that, so if you have a female, she's incubating and she hears you and I walking down a trail, she might leave the nest. So we see her, we have no idea where the nest is because she might have walked 30 yards away by the time we see her. And then once we're gone, she'll circle back and get back on the nest again. The nest generally in that group of birds is pretty well camouflaged. The eggs are well camouflaged as well. So I think, whereas if she's sitting on it, she's going to likely be more obvious, right? Because she's a big, dark bird and sitting, and she's going to look like a rock probably because of her size and sort of her shape. But if she leaves before we get close, we're not going to know there's any nest there. So I think that is a key element for making their nests hard to find. However, if someone, it's like any other bird nest, if someone was dedicated enough and put in the time, I'm sure they'd find nests. It's just, you have to be sort of systematic about it.
Yes.
You could do it, but I think it would be a little bit of an effort.
Okay.
Just because it's really kind of contradictory because the bird itself is so conspicuous. It's like, how can they blend in? But they're pretty good at it.
Yeah. When you talk about nest building, we know many birds build nests in very different ways. Are they actually building a nest with materials, or are they just digging a hole in the ground?
It's more of a scrape in the ground. They might line it with like grasses and things like, or dead leaves or things like that. But they're not building like an oriole type nest or a hawk type nest by putting a bunch of sticks together. And again, that's partly a strategy, right? If it doesn't look like a nest, then you could walk right past the nest and the eggs and not see them.
So it doesn't look out of place.
Correct.
Yeah. You talked earlier about their diet and some of what they eat. Talked about acorns, and I witnessed them eating droppings from feeders. But where else might they eat in the wild? Are they mostly just looking for seeds?
They do eat a lot of seeds, but they do eat other things as well. So they'll eat fruits. If there's like a hackberry bush or something like that where they could reach up and grab the fruits off of the plant, they would do that. They can feed on buds like new leaf buds, flower buds. Again, if they can reach it, they will feed on it.
Yeah.
Some insects in their diet as well, but most of their food they're getting, or almost all of their food, I should say, they're getting from the ground, either them reaching down to pick it up off the ground or plucking it off of the vegetation.
That's fair. When I first started looking up wild turkeys, one of the things that popped up was their population decline a few hundred years ago, and then their recent rebound. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the wild turkeys in North America, as the Europeans moved westward from the Atlantic seaboard, they converted forest, woodland into agricultural fields and pastures and things of that nature. So that's not good habitat for the turkey. So they started to decline. And then as you add to that the fact that they were big birds that were relatively easy to hunt, they declined, and they declined pretty drastically. And it sort of hit the eastern turkey first because that was the first population the Europeans encountered. And as we headed west, it then became the Rio Grande turkey, eventually reaching the Merriam's turkey and the Gould's turkey in Arizona. They all declined. And again, habitat loss / alteration was the big factor. Overhunting contributed to it. However, starting in the 20th century, or even the late 19th century, a lot of the old farms were abandoned. And over time, the native woodland sort of came back. And so a lot of the habitat over time became again suitable for the wild turkey. So they had more habitat. Plus, there's been a lot of conservation done on their behalf by governmental agencies. Nonprofits have all contributed to restoring habitat, setting aside habitat, that sort of thing. And reintroductions, taking birds from one area and putting them into an area they used to inhabit to allow them to come back. All of that has been very successful. And you could make the argument, in my mind, that the wild turkey is now more abundant than it may have ever been. The little bit of the sort of messy details is that sometimes during these translocations, populations were moved outside of their normal range. So they might have taken like an eastern wild turkey and moved it to Idaho, where there never was any eastern wild turkeys. So there's been a little bit of that, and where the different subspecies come together, they often hybridize, which again is sort of what we would expect them to do because they are the same species. And so sometimes it could be a little difficult to know if you're looking at a bird exactly what subspecies it is, because it could be of hybrid origin. But in the big scheme of things, that doesn't much matter when you consider the fact that the bird is now very secure in its populations. And so hunting is now allowed in a lot of places. In fact, the Gould's wild turkey that's being reintroduced in the Huachucas, its population is now stable enough that Game and Fish is allowing hunting of them. So that's a good sign. I mean, they're doing pretty well. When they were domesticated, this was really fascinating to me. They were domesticated, archaeologists think, historians think, about 2,000 years ago. And it was populations in Mexico. And those are ones that the Spaniards encountered first. And the Spaniards saw these big birds that were, they didn't fly very much. They're not like a small bird that they had to keep in a cage. They could take them on their ships back to Europe. And then from Spain, wild turkeys were wild turkeys in the sense of the species name, not that they were running wild, but they kind of spread around Europe after the Spaniards brought them back and became barnyard birds in Europe. And then the Europeans brought them back to the East Coast. And so kind of completing the circle. So wild turkeys, for a bird that doesn't really fly all that far at any given flight, it's covered a lot of ground across the ocean twice. And so the first domesticated wild turkeys in the U.S. were probably brought to North America from Europe after they were originally taken from Mexico. It's believed that the Mayans were one of the first groups to domesticate the turkey. And I mentioned earlier there's two species of wild turkey. It seems very clear that the origin of all the domesticated turkeys is our wild turkey, not the ocellated turkey that also occurs in Mexico. So they've done quite well for themselves, and it was a much longer domestication period than I ever would have thought. I would have thought it was, maybe a few hundred years. But no, it's estimated to be 2,000 years, and they went from Mexico to Europe, spread around Europe through human means, and then brought back on ships back to the eastern seaboard from Europe, even though they were there all along. So that's kind of the route of domestication of wild turkeys. And if you look at some turkey farms, raise birds that look very much like wild turkeys, except they're probably a little bit bigger because of sort of selective breeding. Other wild turkeys are the white ones. They're like all white feathered. And the only way those things are getting off the ground if there's a tornado or a hurricane. But that was kind of the route of domestication of the wild turkey. There seems to be not much evidence that the Native Americans in North America really raised the wild turkey, at least in any substantial sense. That it was further south in Mexico where that happened, and that's where the domestication process started.
In the beginning of the episode, we alluded to the connection to Thanksgiving coming up here in a few days. What can you tell us about that connection between some of these turkeys, this domestication, and then, our dinner tables?
It's a very tight connection these days. It's interesting. There are only 2 written records that have survived that talk about the first Thanksgiving back in Plymouth Colony in 1621. It appears as though the main food that was eaten besides the native vegetables was venison. The Wampanoag tribe brought 5 deer to the feast, and it lasted several days. They also do mention wild fowl, but they're not specific. So that could mean turkeys. It could mean ducks and geese. It's hard to say, but birds were part of it. It's just unclear if turkeys were. It was not really until President Lincoln declared Thanksgiving as a national holiday in 1863 that the connection that we see today really came with turkey. So it's a relatively recent, I mean, the whole thing is relatively recent on the broad time scale, but it seems as though our consumption of turkey on Thanksgiving holiday originates with the declaration of that day as a national holiday in 1863.
Okay. Well, once we sit around that Thanksgiving table, we've got a few things we can share with the other people at the table. They may not want to hear these details, but we'll have them.
Yeah. The turkey will be very mute on the subject, I'm sure.
Yes. Not much to contribute.
Nope.
I'd like to thank Jeff Babson for joining us again, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode from. If you're listening on Apple, I'd appreciate it if you leave a rating or review to help more people discover the podcast. For pictures of the wild turkey and more from this episode, please check out the podcast's Instagram and follow @Looking at Birds Podcast. Until next time, keep looking at birds.